Hi, welcome to our very first virtual UT Brainstorms. I'm Michael Drew. I'm a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at UT Austin and the Center for Learning and Memory. This is not my first Brainstorms, but this is the first time I'm doing it virtually. I'm honored to have the opportunity. I have to say it's a little odd because I'm used to seeing you and now I'm not. But nevertheless, I think we're going to have a great time. Tonight's topic is stress. This was an obvious one for us because so many people are stressed lately because of all that's been going on in our lives and in the world. And a lot of us are under a lot of stress right now. And also in some ways, we've seen some decreases in stress. In some ways, our lives have changed and we might have noticed things that used to be stressful and we didn't even realize it until now. So I'm a neuroscientist, and one of the topics that we study in my lab is how stressful experiences are remembered and how they influence our emotional responses. And even though I study the neuroscience of stress, I often make the mistake of thinking that stress is something that's just in your head, something that's just psychological. But if there's anything I'd like to convince you of tonight, it is that stress is a very real physical and biological process that affects our body in concrete ways, both for the better and sometimes for the worse. Like almost anything in life, stress is best in moderation. We need stress in our lives. We actually wouldn't want to live completely without it, but obviously too much is bad. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to tell you about some of the ways in which stress affects us for better or worse, and how we can better manage the stress in our lives. Stress is a huge topic. It was really hard for me to pick out what I should talk about and what I should leave out. So I'm going to focus on the things that the studies and the findings that I think are really interesting and important. And just a reminder, like all brainstorm events, at the end of my talk, we'll have a live Q&A with a panel of experts. We have two great panelists tonight, and I'll introduce them at the end. If you want to ask questions, what we ask you to do is to use the YouTube comments section, and you can enter comments at any time throughout the talk, but we'll wait until the end to address your comments. And so here we go. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the history of stress research. There we go. So until about 100 years ago, the word stress really wasn't part of neuroscience at all. The study of stress, the scientific study of stress, began about 100 years ago with two important researchers. One of them was Walter Cannon, who was a great American physiologist. He was a trauma surgeon in addition to being a scientist. And one of the experiences that influenced his scientific life was treating severely wounded soldiers. And one of the things he noticed is that when the body sustains a severe wound, there are very specific changes that the body undergoes immediately to try to counteract those effects. And so these are changes in blood supply, the availability of sugar, the blood's clotting capacity. And according to Cannon, the body immediately underwent this change to marshal a, quote, violent display of energy. Cannon realized that these changes, weren't just evoked by severe physical injuries, they could also be evoked by psychological threats. And Cannon coined the term fight or flight response to describe these changes in the body. Cannon also coined the term homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is the body's desire to maintain a certain steady state in a variety of systems. And so one of the things that would evoke the fight or flight response is when the body is either diverted away from homeostasis, or there's the threat of diverting away from homeostasis. And Cannon also identified that the sympathoadrenal system, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, was important in mediating this fight or flight response. And so while Cannon was the first to highlight this acute stress response, there was another important physiologist named Hans Selye, who delved more into the long-term effects of stress. And Selye, his case was interesting because he stumbled onto stress serendipitously. He was also a physiologist. He was doing experiments in with rats in the lab. And he was studying what he thought was a new hormone. They thought they had discovered a new hormone, and they were injecting this compound into rats. And Selye injected this stuff into rats, and he saw a really interesting pattern of effects. He saw that after the rats had been injected several times with this stuff, their adrenal glands would swell, their thymus gland, which is a gland that's very important for the adaptive immune system, would shrink, and the rats would get gastric ulcers. And so Selye thought he was really onto something because this compound had such interesting effects. But then when he ran his control experiments, he discovered that all the other compounds that he injected had the same effects. And what seemed to be the case was that Selye just wasn't very adept at handling his rats, and the rats were getting really stressed out. And so from these initial observations, Selye came to discover what we now call the stress response. And he termed it the general adaptation syndrome. And according to Selye, it had these three parts to it. First, when we first encounter a stressor, there's an alarm that activates our stress response. And then the activation of the stress response builds up some resistance. It helps us counter the stress. And that's all great. And if we're able to successfully deal with the stressor, then we recover. But if we don't, right, if that stressor is continuous, if it's chronic, we end up in this exhaustion state where our ability to deal with stressors is actually diminished, okay? And this exhaustion state is something that we're really interested in now, and this is what, chronic stress does to us. And so part of my talk is going to talk about, we're going to come back to that later. And by the way, Hans Selye was the person who introduced the word stress to biology. So before Selye, stress was a concept in physics, but not in neuroscience or biology. And Selye, English was actually not his native tongue. And later in life, he wrote that he regretted choosing the term stress. Because according to Selye, stress actually refers more to the stressor, the thing that is affecting the body. Whereas Selye was really more interested in the body's response. And he said if he could do it over again, he might have chosen the word strain instead of stress. So if things had been a little bit different, we might be talking about strain today rather than stress. So what is the stress response? There are two major parts to it, okay? And I think most people are probably already familiar with these, so I'll run through these quickly, okay? But if you need a shorthand to think about the stress response, a good way to think about it is that it's the body's way of marshaling all of its resources to confront an immediate threat, okay? And this means curtailing processes that are geared toward preparing the body for the future. And instead, so suppressing preparation for the future, and instead focusing all of its resources on the present and whatever threat we're encountering. And if you think about stress that way, it all makes a lot of sense. So one component of the stress response is activating the sympathetic nervous system. This is one arm of our autonomic nervous system. So this is the nervous system that we don't have voluntary control over. And the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is very fast because it's mediated by nerves that can conduct impulses very quickly. These nerves have terminals all over our body that cause a variety of different responses. So activating the sympathetic nervous system is going to dilate our pupils, so our eyes can take in more light. When we're confronting an immediate threat, we don't really need to eat. So digestion and saliva production is going to be suppressed. Our bronchi are going to be dilated so our lungs operate more efficiently. Our heart rate's going to accelerate. Our blood pressure is going to increase. We're of course going to have release of epinephrine or adrenaline, which mediates some of these effects. We need energy. So our liver is going to be stimulated to release glucose, which provides a ready source of energy. Our stomach, the contractions in our stomach and our small intestine are going to cease because we don't need to digest food, right? The food that's in our stomach is not going to help us right now. It might help us a few hours from now. And so that's going to stop. When you think about these things, it all makes a little sense. And you can probably recall if you've been severely stressed and you've just eaten a big meal, that food is kind of going to sit in your stomach. Conversely, another thing that can happen when you're really stressed is that you might have some diarrhea. So why does that happen? Well, it turns out that the sympathetic nervous system, although it suppresses contractions in the stomach and the small intestine, it actually accelerates them in the large intestine. And so the large intestine basically isn't going to have time to fully process waste, and it's going to get excreted immediately. And that gives us the uncomfortable experience that we have sometimes when we're stressed. So that's half of the acute stress response. And the other half has to do with the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is a slower response because it's mediated by the release of a variety of hormones. And the short story, right, is that our brain sends a signal to the master gland, the pituitary, and the pituitary does a variety of things. One of the things it does is it stimulates the adrenals to secrete glucocorticoids. There are a few of them. The most famous one is cortisol. And cortisol does a variety of things in service of the stress response. So it will suppress release of insulin, right? Insulin is usually telling our cells to store energy, store glucose. And so if we suppress insulin, we're going to do less storing of energy so that's immediately available. Sex and reproduction is not so important when we have an immediate threat. Sex hormones are going to be suppressed. Growth hormones as well, right? Growing is something that's not going to help us immediately. That's something for the future, and we don't need that when we're immediately threatened. So those are suppressed. And the pituitary secretes a couple other interesting things too. So prolactin is one. Prolactin we usually think of as a hormone involved in milk letdown, but it also is actually stimulated during the stress response. And one of the effects of that is to suppress sexual arousal, obviously something you don't need when you're confronted by a big time threat. And then vasopressin. Vasopressin affects our kidneys and causes retention of water, increases our blood volume, okay? And so, as you can imagine, all of these things are really adaptive and really useful when we're trying to encounter a big threat. There are also really interesting effects of this stress response in the brain, and I'll get into some other ones later, but one really powerful effect is that activation of the acute stress response causes the brain to increase secretion of a neuromodulator called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline has really interesting effects all over the brain. It increases alertness and vigilance. And it also has powerful effects on memory consolidation. It helps turn short-term memories into long-term memories. And that can show up in this phenomenon called the flashbulb memory, okay? You know, if you've been through a traumatic experience or a very stressful experience, we usually develop really strong, detailed memories of those experiences. That's called a flashbulb memory. Many of us have a flashbulb memory of this event. I certainly do. And I think I'll tell you about my memory, my flashbulb memory, because it illustrates how norepinephrine really affects memory. So my experience on 9/11 was that I was living in New York at the time. And in the morning, I went to the gym. And I'm leaving the gym, and I see a whole bunch of people crowded around a television set. And I kind of made a mental note of it, but I figured, oh, there must be some important news today, who knows? And so I just kept on walking. And as I'm crossing the street, I'm crossing Broadway, and some guy comes up to me who I don't know, and he says, they brought down the South Tower. And so this is New York, and my natural assumption, since a stranger is trying to talk to me, is that this person must be crazy. And so I ignored him and I kept on going. And then when I got to my lab, I must have turned on the TV, and then I saw what was really happening. But what's interesting to me is that when I finally learned about the attacks, the effect of that was actually to strengthen my memories that had performed just prior, okay? My memories of leaving the gym and crossing the street, okay? And that kind of illustrates one of the things that norepinephrine does. It facilitates memory consolidation. So taking a short-term memory and storing it for the long term. And you can demonstrate this in the laboratory too. And so there have been a variety of interesting studies. I'll just briefly tell you about one of them. So this was a study where people were taken into the lab, and they were given a story to read. And the story starts off very mundane, and then in the middle of the story, there's a car accident, really something emotionally arousing. And then it ends the story has a mundane ending to it. And then sometime later, the subjects are brought back to the lab and they have a quiz about the content of the story. And what you see in normal people is that their memories for the events around the emotional part of the story is stronger than their memories for the other parts of the story, for the neutral part of the story. Right? So we remember the emotional things better. But interestingly, if the subjects had been given a drug that blocks norepinephrine receptors, you don't get that emotional enhancement of memory. And you also don't get that emotional enhancement of memory in people who have damage to their amygdala. And this shows that the amygdala is an important link, right, in linking the perception of trauma or threat to the release of norepinephrine. And I just want to go back a second to glucocorticoids. I mentioned them already. And I want to talk about them a little bit more because glucocorticoids like cortisol are really fascinating. They're really some of the most complicated hormones that we know of, and people are still trying to figure out all of their functions. So at Selye's time, so remember this is the guy who coined the term stress, thought that glucocorticoids were just another mechanism of enhancing the stress response, okay? Preparing the body to confront an imminent threat. And certainly some of the functions of glucocorticoids that I mentioned before are consistent with that. So he wasn't entirely wrong, but it turns out that the function of glucocorticoids, the functions are a lot more complex than that. And glucocorticoids do other things that really aren't consistent with Selye's idea. And so for instance, you're probably aware that if you get poison ivy, right? Poison ivy is essentially an allergic type reaction. And you get a lot of inflammation around the point of contact. One of the treatments for that is prednisone. And prednisone is a synthetic glucocorticoid. It acts a lot like cortisol, and it suppresses the inflammation. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? If you were trying to prepare to confront an immediate threat, you wouldn't want to suppress inflammation. You probably would want more inflammation. Glucocorticoids also suppress immune function. When people are under the influence of high levels of glucocorticoids, they're more susceptible to infection. That's another thing that it doesn't seem like you would want if you're trying to confront a threat, right? You want to actually enhance immune function. Another thing that glucocorticoids do is they can stimulate hunger. And in particular, when we have high levels of glucocorticoids, we especially desire foods that are high in carbohydrates and fats. And this one also rings very true to me, because I remember when I was in graduate school, I used to, on the way home from the lab, I would pass a McDonald's. And most of the time, the McDonald's was not very appealing to me. It didn't really do it for me. But I distinctly remember whenever I was having a hard time in the lab and things were stressful, experiments weren't working and so on, or I had a paper I couldn't figure out how to write, whatever, all of a sudden McDonald's started to seem pretty appetizing. And that's when I would find myself going to McDonald's. And at the time, I didn't know about this link between glucocorticoids and hunger, but it's real. And so it turns out Selye was wrong. Glucocorticoids, they don't just enhance the stress response, they do some of that, but another function of glucocorticoids seems to be actually to prevent the stress response from overshooting. Okay, so these functions of glucocorticoids that I'm showing you right here are actually about suppressing the stress response, attenuating it, preventing it from overshooting. And so one of the things that glucocorticoids do is actually start to curtail the stress response. So really interesting, complicated molecules. Chronic stress. So what I've talked about so far is acute stress. Acute stress can be really good if we're confronting a threat. But chronic stress, we all know, is not so great. Why not? Okay, and if you think about what I've already said, it should start to become obvious, right? Because when you're undergoing the stress response, right, your body is suppressing the things that would normally do to prepare for the future. And so I'm just going to give you a few examples, not by any means exhaustive, but so if we're chronically stressed, one of the things that tends to happen is that we suppress growth and renewal of various tissues in the body. I'll mention one interesting cross-cultural study from a number of years ago that looked at the effects of stress on growth of children. These researchers compared a variety of cultures, indigenous cultures across the world, and they compared cultures that had stressful rites of passage rituals that were given to children versus cultures that didn't have those stressful rites of passage rituals. And so a stressful ritual might be one that requires a really painful piercing or something like that. And one of their results was that in the cultures that had these stressful rituals during adolescence, people in those cultures, their adult height was actually shorter. So these people didn't grow to be as tall as people from the cultures that didn't have these stressful rituals in adolescence. So, obviously a lot of potential problems with a study like that. It's hard to control for all the various variables. But I mention it because it rings true, and it rings true because we know that chronic stress actually can suppress, it actually does suppress secretion of various growth hormones. Another important link is with osteoporosis, particularly in postmenopausal women. Glucocorticoids, when they're chronically elevated, they suppress differentiation of osteoblasts, right? These are the cells that give rise to new bone tissue. And so if you're chronically stressed, you're going to be less able to replace the bone tissue that's lost with aging. And so there's a strong link between chronic stress and osteoporosis. And then finally, an effect that's close to my own heart, because this is something we study in my own lab, is on adult neurogenesis. And so if you've come to any of my previous brainstorms, you probably know a little bit about adult neurogenesis. There are a couple of regions in the adult brain that continue to produce new nerve cells throughout life. And one of those is the hippocampus, a region that's really important for memory. Also has a role in emotional function. So in the normal hippocampus, we continue to generate neurons throughout life, but in the presence of high levels of glucocorticoids, neurogenesis is suppressed pretty profoundly, okay? And so, this is exactly what you see in chronically stressed animals. You see less neurogenesis, and there's pretty good evidence at this point that reduction in neurogenesis is associated with memory impairments, but it can also affect emotionality. These animals have higher levels of anxiety that might relate to this suppression of neurogenesis. Another big effect of chronic stress is with respect to heart disease. Really strong links there, and I'll just briefly mention a little bit about why those links are there. So if you're chronically stressed, right, during the stress response, your heart is going to beat faster, your blood pressure is going to increase, and that stress on your heart, one of the effects of it is to actually cause hypertrophy of one of your ventricles. So the muscle in that ventricle is actually going to grow, and it's going to grow asymmetrically. This left ventricle tends to grow more than the other ones. And that asymmetrical growth can lead to arrhythmia. Another thing that's going to happen is that if your blood pressure is chronically high, when you have very high blood pressure, it tends to cause these little abrasions in your blood vessels, particularly at the branch points. And those abrasions are places where platelets and other lipids can aggregate and form clots. So this chronic stress is going to be associated with clots. And those things would be bad enough on their own, but they can also lead to a sort of vicious cycle, right? So if you have this ventricular hypertrophy and you have clotting problems in your arteries because of stress, these are going to be especially problematic the next time you're stressed, right? Because when you're stressed, right, again, your heart rate's going to increase, okay? If you have this excess development of your ventricle, that's going to require even more oxygen, more blood flow. But if your arteries are clogged, you're going to be less able to provide the heart with the oxygen that it needs. And this is going to cause all sorts of problems. So the link with heart disease and stress is very real. I'd like to also mention some of the work on the effects of stress during development. And I want to show you a video that could be it is a little bit disturbing. And so if you have children watching, you might want to have them take a break for another minute or two. The study I want to tell you about was from around the end of World War II by a psychiatrist named Renee Spitz. And Spitz undertook study of children who were being raised in hospital settings. And in particular, he compared two groups. There was one group of children who were orphans, and they were raised in an institution where they were getting clothed and sheltered, but the nursing staff, they just didn't have enough nurses on hand to really give these kids the sort of physical interactions and attention, loving interactions that the kids needed. But at the time, they thought that wasn't really important. As long as we're feeding the kids and we're giving them shelter, that ought to be enough, and the kids will be fine. So that was one group. And then the other group of children, these children were also being raised in an institutional setting, hospital and such, but they weren't orphans, they were with their mother. And so it was a nice comparison, because you had two groups of children that were raised in the same kind of setting, but one with these loving interactions of the mother and another group without. And I should emphasize that this was not an experiment in the exact sense, right? This was an observational study. So these kids were already in these hospital settings, and Spitz was just observing the outcomes. What he observed in the orphans, the kids without their mothers, was really profound. It's a syndrome that he called Anaclitic depression or hospitalism. It's something that we would now call failure to thrive. And so I'm going to show you a really brief video of just one of these children who grew up without interactions without close interactions with a caregiver. And what you can see is that these children are very lethargic. They don't move around very much. They exhibit very strange motor stereotypies, repeated movements. They have vacuous expressions on their faces, inappropriate emotional reactions. And sadly, many of these children who were raised in the institutional setting without the mother, many of them died before they reached maturity. And they died of illnesses. They seemed to have weaker immune systems. They were more susceptible to a variety of illnesses. So why am I showing you this? What we're looking at here is not just an effect of stress. Stress is part of it. So what we know about this syndrome is that part of it is caused because the developing brain needs certain patterns of stimulation from parents and other close caregivers for proper neural development to occur. That's how the nervous system works, okay? So part of what you're seeing there is the lack of appropriate patterns of stimulation. But another part of it probably has to do with the stress of not having those infant-parent interactions. And that may explain the impoverished immune systems that these children have. So why do we think this? Part of the reason is from some follow-up studies that are sort of infamous by a psychologist named Harlow. These studies were ethically very questionable, but Harlow's intention was to understand what is the nature, and he was building on the work of Spitz, and he wanted to understand, what is the nature of these mother-infant interactions? Why do children need their mothers? And at the time, one of the influences over the work was B.F. Skinner, who, and according to the Skinnerian tradition, people might have thought that, well, the only reason you need your mother is because your mother provides nourishment. It's sort of an operant conditioning type scenario. You go to your mother and you get fed. But what Harlow found is that that's actually not the whole story. And the way he discovered that is he took these monkeys, these infant monkeys, and took them away from their their mothers. So they were raised in the absence of a mother, and they would have access to these surrogates, these dummies. And some of them would be raised with a wire surrogate like this one. It doesn't look very hospitable, but the wire surrogate you can see here would provide milk, okay? And others would have access to a furry, more cuddly one like this. And one of the things that Harlow found is that even if the wire surrogate would provide milk and the cuddly surrogate didn't, the monkeys would still prefer the cuddly surrogate. So they'd go to the wire surrogate to get milk, but then they'd spend much more of their time with the cuddly surrogate. There's something really important about having that sort of tactile interaction. The other thing he found is in some studies, he compared monkeys who had the cuddly surrogate to monkeys that only had the wire surrogate. And what he found is that there was a big effect on the emotionality of these monkeys. The monkeys that had access to the cuddly surrogate were more well-adjusted. The ones that only had access to the wire surrogate would be much more anxious and fearful when they were exposed to a novel environment or a novel stimulus. They had digestive problems and diarrhea. And so just having access to this cuddly surrogate was enough to at least partially normalize the emotional status of the monkey. More recently, now fast forwarding to the 20th century, neuroscientists have tried to figure out, what are the mechanisms through which these mother-infant interactions actually affect the brain? And there's been a lot of work on this. I'll just mention one study briefly by Michael Meaney in his laboratory in Montreal. What Meaney's been studying is parenting in mice. And his studies are really interesting because he looks at mice that are all genetically identical to each other. Okay, so all these mice are essentially twins of each other. They all have the same genes, but their behavior can be very different. And so one of the things he found is that there are good mothers and there are bad mothers. The good mothers are ones that, among other things, they do a lot of licking and grooming of their pups. Okay, so grooming the fur and licking various regions on the pup's body. And that licking and grooming behavior is profoundly important for the emotional development of the mice. And in particular, the mice that have the good mother, the high licking and grooming mother, grow up to be significantly less anxious than the mice that are from low licking and grooming mothers. And we know that this is not some kind of genetic effect, because you can do these cross-fostering experiments where you take mice from a bad mother, and right after they're born, you foster them with a good mother, or vice versa. You can take mice from a good mother and have them fostered by a bad mother. And what he finds is that their adult behavior is determined not by their biological mother, but by the behavior of the mother that they're fostered to. And what's really interesting is that this licking grooming behavior during a relatively short period of their infancy has lifelong effects on the brain. And one of the effects you can see in the hippocampus. So here I'm showing you images of mouse hippocampus. And this is the color coding shows you expression of glucocorticoid receptors, right? And the red is high level of glucocorticoid receptors, and the darker colors are low levels. And what you see in the adult is that the pups that had been that were from a high licking and grooming mother, a good mother, have more glucocorticoid receptors in the adult hippocampus than mice that had the poor mothers, the low licking and grooming mothers. Those mice have fewer glucocorticoid receptors in the adult hippocampus. And Meaney figured out that this is because of an epigenetic change. So during the actual licking and grooming in infancy, there are epigenetic marks that form that basically cause lifelong changes in gene expression. And so you might be wondering, well, why would having fewer glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus, why would that make a mouse more anxious, right? So what I'm telling you here is that the low licking and grooming pups, actually, their hippocampi seem to be less responsive to glucocorticoids than the high licking and grooming mice. So, it seems a little bit paradoxical. Why would that be? Why would low glucocorticoid receptor expression be associated with an anxiety? And here's one of the reasons for that. So the hippocampus, so here a really simple circuit diagram. Hippocampus, we usually think of this as a memory organ, right? It's really important for episodic memories, declarative memories, but it also has an emotional functions. And one of its functions is actually to provide negative feedback regulation of the HPA axis. So the reason why, or one of the reasons why the hippocampus has these glucocorticoid receptors is because it senses the glucocorticoids, and then it tells the HPA axis to shut off, okay? So the hippocampus is actually part of the way the HPA axis shuts off after a stressor is ended. And so now you can understand, if you don't have enough glucocorticoid receptors in the hippocampus, you're not going to get as much of this negative feedback regulation of the HPA axis. And your stress responses are going to go on longer, and they're going to be exaggerated. And that's not the only thing. So even if you just have chronic stress in adulthood, okay, you can also have profound effects on the hippocampus. And there's been lots of work showing that with chronic stress, your hippocampus actually shrinks. And here I'm just showing you some work tracing individual neurons in animals that were either exposed to chronic stress or they were not exposed to chronic stress. And you see a really interesting divergence between what happens in the hippocampus and what happens in the amygdala. So in the hippocampus, if you get chronically stressed, your hippocampus shrinks, and you actually see that the neurons in your hippocampus shrink. So these are the dendrites of a neuron in the hippocampus. These are the parts of the neuron that receive information. And you can see that they're not as ramified in this stressed animal here. That's probably not a good thing for hippocampal memory. In the amygdala, you see the opposite. In the stressed animal, these neurons are actually growing. Their dendritic arbors are actually becoming more ramified, okay? So in the stressed animal, your amygdala is growing, your hippocampus is shrinking. That's probably going to have a profound impact. And your amygdala, like I mentioned before and in another Brainstorms talk, is really important for recognizing threats, evoking fear responses, learning about fears, learning about threats. And so it's probably the case that this increasing, this hypertrophy of neurons in the amygdala is going to lead to more fear responses, more responses to threats. Okay, so that is my rundown of in short, why a little stress is good for you, but a lot of stress is bad. We've talked about reasons why acute stress can really help our ability to fight off a threat, whereas chronically, it's going to impair our ability to do that same thing. And in the few minutes that I have left, I want to talk about, well, what do we actually do about stress? I don't have time to talk about all the interesting work on resilience and treatment for stress-related disorders. So I've just picked out a few things that I think are pretty profound. And one obvious one is about exercise. I'm not going to belabor this one because we already know that exercise is really important. There's lots of good evidence that exercise can counter the effects of chronic stress. It's good for our body. It's equally good for our brain, so do it. But I'll just mention one finding that you might not be aware of, and it comes from more animal research. I love animal research because that's what we do in my lab. One of the things we know is that mice love to run on these running wheels. You put a running wheel like this in the mouse cage, and they will run practically all day. They'll run literally kilometers a day, which is pretty far for a mouse. And one of the effects of this exercise is that it stimulates neurogenesis in the hippocampus. So, and this is a slide from my lab showing this. So these green cells here are newborn neurons in the hippocampus, labeled with a green fluorophore. And what you can see is that in the mice that get access to the running wheel, you have a lot more of these newborn neurons than in the mice that don't have access to the running wheel. And so that exercise can actually counteract the effects of stress. Stress is going to suppress neurogenesis, and running is going to enhance it. But another interesting finding is that you don't want to force it, right? Because if we look at, so there have been studies that compare the effects of forced running wheel running versus voluntary running like this. And it turns out that, so here are a bunch of different groups of mice that are doing voluntary running, and this is their corticosterone level. So corticosterone is the analog of cortisol that mice have. That's a glucocorticoid. What you can see is when they start running, you get a burst of corticosterone. But then if you're voluntarily running, eventually goes away, okay? And the running doesn't evoke that cort release anymore. But what's interesting is that the running is forced, that boost in glucocorticoid release is sustained, okay? The running itself is a stressor. And so I take that to mean that, yeah, running is great, but if you really hate it, and it's going to become a stressor for you in itself, then it's probably not a good thing. It's much better to find exercise that we can enjoy. So the effects of stress on us are physically very real. But that's not to say that our perception of stress doesn't matter. It really does. And I want to mention some old work that's relevant here, and this phenomenon of learned helplessness that was discovered, back in the 1960s, but it continues to be something that's really of interest to neuroscientists, because it's a profound phenomenon, and it's fascinating too. So these original learned helplessness studies were done with dogs. We don't do them with dogs anymore, but at the time that's what people did. And it's a little bit of a complicated procedure, but there are two phases to it. And in the first phase, you have a dog here that would get foot shocks here through this grid, but he could learn to avoid the shocks by pressing this lever that's suspended, okay? So eventually, the dog learns to hit this lever and mostly avoid the shocks. It's occasionally gets shocked, but he can mostly avoid them. Then there's this other dog that's called the yoked control. And this dog, what's really cool about this is that this dog is yoked to this dog in the sense that whenever this dog gets shocked, this dog also gets shocked. But the difference is that this dog has no control over it, right? He doesn't have access to this manipulandum, right? He can't avoid the shocks, okay? So these two dogs are both going to get the exact number of shocks, the exact duration of shocks, the exact distribution of shocks, but the effects on the animal are completely different. And so for one thing, if you do this phase 2, in phase 2, both of the dogs have controllable or avoidable shocks, okay? So now both dogs, if they want to, they hurdle over from one side to the other, they can avoid the shocks. But only this dog learns to do it. And this dog is learned helpless, right? It's learned that, or it has the belief that its behavior is, that it is ineffectual in controlling the shocks, and hence the dog never really learns to avoid the shock, even though it could. But that's not where the differences end. The effects of stress are much more profound in the control dog than in the dog that was exposed to controllable shock. This dog here, the control dog, the control condition dog, is going to stop grooming, eat less sex drive, disorganized sleep, elevated glucocorticoids, gastric ulcers, poorer immune function. A whole host of chronic stress effects show up in this dog, but not this dog. It's really profound. Okay, even though the physical stressor that these two dogs are receiving is exactly the same. So it turns out, fast forwarding a few years, that the controllability itself isn't the only important thing here. Perceived controllability also matters, okay? And so another old study in humans, they took people into the lab and they hit them with a bunch of uncontrollable, really annoying, noxious noise. And so you had two groups of people and they're both getting exposed to these uncontrollable, really annoying noise. But there's a difference. And in this subject, there's one difference. This subject has a button, okay? And this button, they're told if they press this button, it'll shut off the noise, okay? But here's the interesting part. The experimenters tell these subjects, you know, we're gonna give you the button will turn off the noise, but you know what? We really don't want you to press the button. If you can avoid pressing the button, please avoid pressing it. And it turns out by the end of the experiment, the subjects in condition 2, none of them actually pressed the button. Nevertheless, their experience of the noise was completely different from the people in this group without the button. The people with access to the button, even though they didn't press it, they found the noise less aversive, they found it less stressful, including according to physiological measures, and they did better, they performed better on later tests, just like what we saw in the dogs. And so, at least sometimes, just believing we have control is enough to mitigate some of the effects of a stressor on our health. Pretty amazing. And this phenomenon has grown in a really interesting way into work in the educational realm. And the last thing I want to tell you about just briefly is really interesting work started by a psychologist named Carol Dweck, and more recently it's been followed up by others, including David Yeager, who's a faculty member in the psychology department at UT. And their work has been on what's called the growth mindset. If you have children in school, you've probably heard of this. I know our kids who go to public school in Austin have heard a lot about the growth mindset, and I think it's great. And the idea of the growth mindset is that you should see your brain as a muscle that grows stronger and smarter when it undergoes rigorous learning experiences, okay? And that's in contrast with the fixed mindset. If you have a fixed mindset, you think that your performance reflects your innate abilities, okay? That you have these innate abilities, and those abilities determine whether you do well at something and whether you don't, okay? Like, if you believe that how you do in math depends on how smart you are or your intrinsic mathematical ability, if you do poorly on a math test, you're likely to think, well, that just means I'm not smart or I'm not good at math, okay? Whereas if you have the growth mindset, failure doesn't reflect on an innate ability, right? It reflects more on your approach, okay? Did I study enough? Did I work hard enough, okay? So it turns out that your beliefs or your child's belief about whether their brain is plastic or not, and that their abilities can grow and change, has a profound effect on their approach to learning and their learning outcomes. And I don't have enough time to go into all the interesting research out there. But I just want to mention, because there was a recent study that just came out in the journal Nature last year. So Nature is really the highest level of scientific journal. And they published a study led by David Yeager, a national experiment where they studied over 12,000 ninth graders in the United States, and a really broad cross-sectional sample that included students from all different socioeconomic classes, all different types of schools. And they did an experiment where they gave kids in these schools, these 12,000 kids, an intervention, a very short intervention actually, it was two self-administered online sessions, each lasting only 25 minutes. Some of the kids were trained in the growth mindset, and some of the kids were trained in a control condition. And then at the end of the school year, at the end of the 9th grade year, they looked at academic performance. And what was really amazing is that this relatively mild, short intervention had a pretty strong effect. And so here I'm showing just one summary graph that shows the effect of the magnitude of the effect. And it's broken down according to the school achievement level. So high achieving schools and low achieving schools, you saw an effect in both cases. And they also broke it down according to whether the schools were supportive of learning, like if the cultural environment of school was supportive of learning or unsupportive of learning. And the point is that across all of these different conditions, there was a positive treatment effect, meaning that the growth mindset training enhanced performance. And the average enhancement was about range from 0.08 to 0.25 grade points in 9th grade. And that might not sound like a lot, but when you consider that this was just 2 online sessions of 25 minutes each, it's pretty incredible. And so how does this relate to stress? I mean, I think this relates back to this concept of controllability, right? If you're doing bad in math and you think it's due to your innate ability, this is essentially an uncontrollable stressor. But if you think that you're doing bad in math, but it's because of something that's underneath your control, like your study habits, etc., it's going to have a big effect on how that negative, that aversive experience of failure affects you and how you respond to it. So perceived controllability is what we're talking about here. And it has a really profound effect on children and adults when dealing with challenges. Okay, I want to stop there and just summarize that, in short, stress is a really good thing, or a stress response is a good thing because it mobilizes our resources to confront a threat, and it does it in a really intelligent way. But chronic stress is not such a good thing, and it leads to all sorts of psychiatric, neurological, physiological effects that are very real, like heart disease, changes in growth of tissue and restoration, and profound changes in the brain. But we can head off these changes just by changing how we think about stress in ways that I've talked about, and in particular this growth mindset. And I just wanted to mention one other thing, because I touched on the studies of Spitz on the children with Anaclitic depression. I also touched on these cultures where exposure to stress in adolescence reduces growth. And what I want to say is I don't want to scare people, okay? And so, these effects that Spitz studied and these effects of stress in infants that are studied in the laboratory are pretty extreme. Typically don't see deleterious effects of stress in children unless it's really severe. And I know a lot of parents right now, myself included, we're thinking, we have our kids at home, and a lot of parents are really worried, are we doing enough to educate our children at home? Are we giving them enough enrichment? And those are reasonable questions, but I think it's important to keep it in perspective. And if you look at the studies, some of the studies that I mentioned tonight, what is clear is that if we're just providing our kids with a safe, loving environment, and we're paying attention to them, and we're interacting with them, and we care about them, that is a very profound thing. And that has a much more profoundly positive impact on our children than missing a day of schoolwork or missing a week of schoolwork, and etc. And so I just encourage people to keep that in perspective. And with that, I am going to first give a shout out to my lab. I didn't really have a chance to talk about the work that's going on in the Drew lab at UT Austin, but we are interested in stress, and in particular about how stressful experiences are remembered and how those memories affect our emotional well-being. These are the folks in my lab. This is a picture from one of our socially distanced Zoom lab meetings, but we're hoping to soon be back in the lab doing more, getting our research going again. If you want to learn more about our lab, you can use this link over here. With that, I'd like to introduce our panel. We're going to start taking questions, and our panelists, we have two great panelists. One is Dr. Laura Culligan, who's associate professor in the neuroscience department. She's also co-director of the Center for Learning and Memory at UT Austin. She's an expert on brain rhythms and the hippocampus, and hippocampal memory. She's received many, many awards. Young Investigator Award from the Office of Naval Research, National Foundation Career Award. I can go on. Our other panelist is Marissa Toups. Marissa is an assistant professor in psychiatry at UT Austin. She's also a psychiatrist at the Mulva Clinic for Neurosciences. She's an expert in brain immune interactions. And in addition to being a doctor, she's also a neuroscientist, and she runs a research lab focused on how genes mediate brain immune interactions. And she has a lot of interesting things to say about stress, I'm sure. And with that, I'm going to turn on, I'm going to stop my slide share. Oops. And ask Laura and Marissa to turn on their video and start answering questions. I think you guys can turn your sound on. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Hi,
hello.
everybody.
Hi.
Oh, I can start out with this one actually because it's related to a new project that is starting up in my lab, or that has been going on in my lab, but it's a relatively new project. Can poor parenting in developmental years create lifelong anxiety problems? Do anxious parents impact the likelihood of children developing anxiety issues? So this is an active area of research that is something that my lab is really interested in. And we've been looking at a model of early life maternal neglect. So basically it's like a model when the rats are pups in the nest and the mother has limited resources. So she's stressed out and she's kind of trying to forage around and getting what she needs. And she's not in that nest engaging in those behaviors that Michael was talking about, like licking her pups as much as she normally would be, or, you know, wrapping her body around her pups and staying in the nest with them as much as she would be. And then after that short period, the resources are returned to the mother. And what we're looking at in my lab is that actually, even when the rats reach middle age, so this, you know, putting it into the human perspective, you know, this would be much, much, much later in life, they can continue to have issues related to this early life experience. And not only anxiety issues and, you know, possibly cardiovascular issues, although I should say, you know, we're interested in the brain, so we're not studying that part of it, but they have issues related to learning and memory, and deficits in the hippocampus, this area of the brain that Michael was mentioning in his talk, that's really important for learning and memory, but also plays a role in anxiety. And so what we are looking at is what sort of interventions can we do to alleviate those issues. You know, as the pups are growing up, what kind of interventions can we do? Like, you know, at what stage of life is maybe like training in an enriched environment important, or like additional learning experiences or things like this. So yeah, that's kind of a long answer, but can poor parenting in developmental years create lifelong anxiety problems? Yes. But hopefully ones that interventions can treat and prevent.
I definitely agree with Michael that when you're talking about humans, we're not talking about like you missed their soccer game. We're talking about like severe abuse and neglect. So don't worry that if you're a little anxious yourself and your kid's a little anxious that you're going to somehow ruin them. And when we look at these animal models, they're models of much more severe experiences than most people and their children will have in real life.
True. This would be more like a model that would be similar to the type of neglect that Michael had talked about when, you know, maybe children that are in an orphanage or something like that.
I see some questions about neurogenesis, and so one of the questions is about why does exercise stimulate neurogenesis? It's a really good question. I would say we don't fully have the answer. You know, one of the things we know is that exercise, at least in the animal models, stimulates a variety of neurotrophins, right? BDNF is one of them. BDNF is a neurotrophin that stimulates growth of neurons. It helps promote survival of neurons that might otherwise die. And so in the mice that are exercising, you have more BDNF in the hippocampus, and that seems to be one of the reasons why you have more neurogenesis. Is actually more of the cells that are born end up surviving. We don't really know whether the same thing is happening in humans, because it's really hard to study neurogenesis in humans, you know, for a lot of different reasons. So we really don't know that much about what exercise does to neurogenesis in humans. Another question that we don't know the answer to is, you know, why does exercise stimulate neurotrophins in the brain? It could be something physiological about the exercise, but it also be that the mice seem to really like doing it. So it might be that, you know, just engaging in activity that's really pleasurable has this effect in the mice. And so there's a lot more work to be done in that area. But one thing is really clear, and it's a really profound effect across not only mice, but also rats. A variety of different types of exercise do stimulate neurogenesis. And so my own bias is that, you know, let's not split hairs here. You know, exercise is good, and even if it's not stimulating your neurogenesis in a human, I would say do it.
Yeah. No, it's one of the best things that you can do for yourself.
Yeah.
Without question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was looking at another question. A couple of people asked questions about social distancing and stress, and one person particularly asked about, like they said, so humans need hugs. So what is going to be the effect of social distancing? So this is sort of the other big thing that you talked about. And so I have a couple of perspectives. I think one of them obviously is my clinical perspective. And you know, I have been seeing a lot of patients who are over video who are alone and live by themselves and haven't seen too many other people in person in a long time. And then there is also this sort of data-driven perspective on contact. And so I do think a lot of what you talked about today was in young children and infants. And there's a sort of big difference between the need for touch and physical connection in babies than there is in adults. And we have much less good data about what is the impact on adults of touch. And I can say in my experience with patients is that it varies a whole lot about what people feel like they need. But there is a lot of really interesting data where if we go back to talk about the difference between subjective and objective, that whether someone feels lonely is much more important in terms of having a negative impact on their health and mental health than whether they are physically alone. And there's a whole line of research looking at brain diseases, even like Alzheimer's, dementia, and other things, that even people who live with family, if they feel alone, they do worse than the people who are living alone but don't feel alone. And so I think that's really hopeful for people who are isolated right now, that the most important thing you can do is something that makes you feel connected to somebody else. And we are pretty sure that it's that sense of emotional connection, even if it's, a Zoom meeting or a phone call, or you're, physically distanced from other people, that it, at least in adults, is just as important. And that's the thing that really matters, is whether you feel close or not. And the effects on the brain are really much more about your subjective sense than your objective situation.
Amazing. Mm. I'm just reading through, but if you guys see a question that you want to take, just try and take it.
I love the question someone said, well, if you think that, a good mother is good, what about helicopter parenting? And I don't know if we have any models of helicopter parenting in animals, do we? I do think, to me as a clinician, that's sort of a variant of saying, what about people with anxious parents? So oftentimes the helicopter parents are the anxious parents. And so, I do think maybe for some kids that parenting style is a little bit more stressful than for other kids. But, I think this is one where it really depends on the dynamic between the parent and the child.
Yeah.
I see this one that says, how can we overcome harmful thoughts? And, I think that overcoming harmful thoughts, I think that one of the things that you can try to do is to use your own brain to sort of force yourself to think about something different, right? Like, it sounds kind of corny, but if you're thinking a thought in your head, like something bad about yourself, like being really hard on yourself right now, like, oh, I'm not able to do this, or I'm not doing this. If you can just tell yourself, like, why am I being so mean to myself right now? Like, we have a pandemic, just say, instead, whenever my brain starts to go there, like, I'm going to think something good about myself, like what's something that I like about myself, or something, a more positive thought. But I think that also, some of the things that, not to beat a dead horse, but, we've already been talking about exercise and how it increases neurogenesis, but it also increases serotonin levels in your brain. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter. That is really the chemical that is, so important for mood. That's the chemical that's disturbed in people that have clinical depression. So, and serotonin has really interesting effects on your brain. It actually inhibits that area of the amygdala that Michael was talking about, that when that gets activated, it causes fear and anxiety. But it also activates these higher brain areas, these associational areas of the neocortex, which are these really, how to say it, like, they're the brain areas that have developed the most in us as humans. So these are the brain areas that allow people to write symphonies and, write novels, and to also to take control of your own thoughts. So serotonin is activating those areas and inhibiting the sort of, lower brain areas that just cause these more primitive responses. And so that will also allow you to kind of be better able to, take control of your own thoughts and try to stop yourself from going into like a negative pit of despair, and maybe trying to allow yourself to think more positive, happy thoughts about yourself. And other things that increase serotonin levels is like your diet, and other things that are healthy for you can help your serotonin levels as well.
Yeah, serotonin is really fascinating. For a long time, since the discovery of SSRIs, we've known that serotonin has a connection to anxiety and depression, but it's taken a while to figure out the precise mechanisms. And Laura's mentioned a few of them, and I have a colleague and a collaborator who had a paper recently, really interesting one, showing that there are serotonergic projections into the ventral hippocampus that suppress activity in the ventral hippocampus. And it's interesting because ventral hippocampus, so even though we usually think of hippocampus as sort of a memory organ, ventral hippocampus is really involved in emotional responses, and high activity in ventral hippocampus seems to be associated with anxiety. And so the idea is that when your serotonin projections are firing, it's actually tamping down activity in the ventral hippocampus. And in this study showed that seems to alleviate anxiety to some extent. Just consistent with what Laura was saying.
Yeah, I think to be totally frank with you, some of these questions we're not answering because we don't know the answer.
What do I do if I'm stuck in a toxic
we're getting a lot of sort of CBT type questions. People are saying, well, what do I do if my environment really is terrible? Yeah. And I think it's a really important point. And so I'm going to go a little bit, I'm going to put on my clinical hat a little bit for some of these. So, you know, one of the things about life is that oftentimes really bad things do happen to us. And oftentimes your job really is toxic. And oftentimes, you know, you have some situation with your family that is really painful. And so it's important to remember when we talk about this that we're not, bad feelings are normal and we all experience them all the time. And there isn't, the point of that isn't for us to try to be in some state where we never think anything bad ever about anything. And oftentimes what you do to try to overcome things that we would view as harmful, like if you have thoughts that are harmful, that's implying that those thoughts aren't based on what your life is really like. They're thoughts that you're putting onto yourself and hurting yourself. And so when we do things like CBT, the first step is to actually ask yourself, and I think this is part of what you were talking about, Laura, where you ask yourself, like, is this really true? What is this situation? Is it really true that I am a bad person? Or, you know, and you then figure out from that what to do next. And so sometimes the answer is you teach yourself to say, no, it's okay. I don't really believe that. I'm gonna, you know, be my own cheerleader and I'm not gonna be negative. But there are also times, maybe if it is, you really are in a bad situation, then the answer is, what do I need to do to start changing my situation? The idea isn't to like brainwash yourself to put up with things that you shouldn't put up with. And it can be really hard. And I think the other thing it's important to understand as a clinician is that nobody goes to a doctor or their best friend or anybody and they say, what should I do? And their friend says, well, just change the way you're thinking. And then they walk away and it, you know, they're like, okay, I'm done. Boom. No, I'm not depressed. You know, so it takes a lot of practice and time to change the way you think. And every time you do it, your brain grows a little bit and it forms those new connections until you have those circuits in place that are going to help you do better. So don't get frustrated if it doesn't happen right away.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to be, obviously I'm not a clinician and any sort of advice that I'm giving there is more like me search. Like it's more like, these are the things that I do in my life to feel better.
I mean, and it does work. It's just that oftentimes people, when they come to see a psychiatrist, they're like, people keep telling me that and it's just, you know, it doesn't work. And you're like, well, you just have to try for a really long time. Like it's, you know, sometimes we make it sound simple and people feel really frustrated. And I think if you put it in the right context and they do get that feeling of control, right? Like, oh, I can control this. I just have to work on it and I can grow. And then, you know.
Well, I think the good thing about it though, as a neuroscientist too, is that you can say like, yeah, you have to work hard at it because it's hard for your higher brain areas to take control over those lower brain areas that have very strong responses for a reason, because the lower brain controls everything that's essential for our survival.
That's right.
But we do have these higher brain areas that, you know, have evolved to allow us, you know, to take control over the lower brain areas. And so, you know, there is actually like a neuroscientific explanation for
it really does
how you can and how serotonin works together to activate those, you know, higher neocortical regions that are increasing your adaptability, increasing your coping mechanisms through, you know, through your own conscious thoughts, and also inhibiting these areas, like Michael mentioned, the ventral hippocampus or the amygdala, that are just kind of automatically causing, not automatically, but are causing you to, you know, feel fear or anxiety, or yeah, for sometimes for reasons that are not reasonable sometimes.
Yeah.
I see a lot of interesting clinical questions that
So let's
I'm not
take
going to
those
touch.
to the clinician.
I can, if Marissa's reading through the questions, I can answer I can answer one that's right in my wheelhouse though, which is.
I mean, I'm happy to go back and forth if you guys want to. I actually am really interested in this. Someone asked about the concept of stress inoculation.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And so I actually am not familiar with a protocol designed specifically around that in human subjects, but I know there's a lot of animal work on the concept of stress inoculation, which is where you expose someone to a little stressor repeatedly, and then you see how they respond biologically to a larger stressor. And even though I'm not familiar with any protocols in humans, my experience with patients is that that is definitely true. And this is sort of what we talk about when we talk about parenting our kids with tough love and all of those things. That we do, if we've never been exposed to anything stressful, then we can't learn how to handle it. And so it actually is really important to have just the right amount of stress, so that then you're prepared, your system is prepared to handle bigger stressors. I think it's so important when we work with patients and also raise children, as a parent myself, that it's really important to teach your kids to have some stress tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and someone's asking about meditation, a bunch of things.
What was the one you were saying was in your wheelhouse, Michael?
Yeah.
Oh, somebody asked, how does stress cause norepinephrine release? That one's right in my wheelhouse. Well, you know, the easy answer is that the amygdala can directly control it, has projections to the locus ceruleus, which is where the cells that produce norepinephrine, they live in the locus ceruleus. So your amygdala can directly activate noradrenaline release. But the interesting question really is, you know, so how does the amygdala know when you're stressed? And then it gets to be a lot more complicated to figure out, you know. I mean, so we know, yeah, the amygdala is, you know, one of the really key regions for organizing responses to threats, being afraid, right? So if you don't have an amygdala, you basically won't be afraid under any circumstances, essentially. But how does the amygdala know when you're afraid? I mean, it's something that still is debated, and it's actually something my lab has been looking into recently, trying to figure out, you know, when you have a threat to an animal in this case, how does that information get to the amygdala? And it turns out it's really complicated, because these threat circuits, these, threats are something that are so key to our survival or not, that the neural circuitry is really redundant. And if you try to follow the circuitry, you know, from the periphery into the brain, it gets to the brain, then it just goes every which way. That information is highly parallel. And so, but we know that, yeah, when you are afraid, when you're under threat, your amygdala is going to be activated, and it's going to activate. That sort of orchestrates a whole variety of different responses that are involved in responding to a threat.
I think there might be some follow-up questions for Marissa based on some of the things that she was saying earlier.
What resources do you recommend for resilience?
Yeah. I think the first thing to think about is whether we're talking about just like the day-to-day maintenance of what the stresses that we all experience are, or whether you're talking about something that really meets the more serious definition of mental illness. And so my advice would be slightly different for those two groups of people. I think the first thing is that we've already talked about a lot of the things that work. So we know just really unequivocally that everybody should exercise, that exercise is the best possible thing that you can do. It really does impact directly your brain and your neural circuitry. And for many people, it makes them directly feel much better. But we know that even some people don't get as much of like a runner's high or that kind of immediate positive feeling from exercise, but even then you still can get the benefits from it. And I like the fact that you said you should only do what you really enjoy doing, because I think that's definitely true. Other things that we know that are good for people are all the same sorts of things that we talked about. So you want to structure your life in a way that makes you feel like you have some sense of meaning or control. Like rituals that you feel like belong to you, social connection with other people. For most people, that's very important. And someone asked about mindfulness, and I actually think mindfulness is a really, really good one because it helps us with that process that is part of the stress response. If we've lost that ability to stop thinking about planning for the future and just deal with how things are going right now, that's part of the stress response for a reason. And the mindfulness really teaches you to do that if you don't do it just already, right? So it sort of helps back up your innate stress response with this sort of more top-down, like cerebral response, where you say, instead of trying to think about everything that's out there, I'm just going to think about right now, and I'm just going to be in the moment. And there's also lots of evidence from human beings that doing that also changes your brain circuit and helps people's brains function more normally. Which goes to a question someone asked a while ago, which was, are all of these effects on the brain from stress reversible? And the answer is yes, that they definitely are. So even in people with depression, we see when we treat their depression, their hippocampal volume recovers, and other sorts of abnormalities that we actually see in their brain get better. And so all of those things are things that you can do to take care of yourself. And obviously, if what you're experiencing is more serious than that, then you should seek out help from a psychologist or other type of therapist or psychiatrist to have them do a little bit extra that you might need to get you feeling better.
Can people get addicted to stress? I don't know. Does anybody know the answer to that one? It's an interesting question.
I mean, I think from the perspective of like neurobiological changes of addiction, no. But can you, I don't know, like in the lay meaning of addiction, maybe that's not quite the same thing.
I'll mention one thing that's maybe relevant is that, so these work on intracranial self-stimulation, you plunk an electrode into an area of the brain, and in animals or humans even will lever press to stimulate that area. And the original studies were in reward areas like the dopamine producing neurons. But it turns out you can get self-stimulation in a lot of different areas. And so, for instance, there's an area in the midline thalamus that seems to be involved more in sort of aggressive behavior or aggressive responses to threats. And there were studies in humans showing that humans would actually self-administer stimulation of that brain region. So the brain region would kind of make them angry, but they'd self-stimulate in order for that brain region. And so
it's
things
like
can be
reading
reinforcing even if they don't feel good.
It's like the other people's comments on Facebook. You just can't stop reading it. Make you mad when you just keep doing it.
Yeah. So we're actually at 8:30, and we're supposed to stop now. So with that, I guess I want to thank Laura and Marissa for being part of the panel. It was great hearing all you guys had to say, and I want to thank all the people who are listening right now. I wish we could see who you are, but thank you very much for your attention, and we do plan to have more brainstorms. I think this summer there will be announcements forthcoming, and we hope you'll join us. And if you have any comments or questions or suggestions about the format or anything else you saw tonight, please feel free to email us about it. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And thank you to Laura and Elena, our staff members, for making this work so seamlessly.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys did a great job.
Yeah, really great job. No technical problems. That's wonderful.